Let's go, boys.
Oh, you're a wrestler.
Look at this grown-ass man on TikTok.
And what I needed was a titanium shin bone.
I don't know if I have that same drive to hurt people anymore.
It's just another surgery. It's definitely making a difference in how I look.
But on the boat. Goats come and go, but boats stay afloat.
I got the President of the United States. Dragon energy.
It's all over. Donald Cowboy Cerrone.
So here lieth the thing. Sean Strickland's pilgrimage to mythical status starts in the bowels of hell. Raised in a home of violence and substance abuse, Sean Strickland's childhood was anything but conventional. The venom spouted by his father sent him on a path toward hate and bigotry, getting caught up in race supremacy movements. It wasn't until walking into an MMA gym that he would be saved from this repugnant ideology. It was violence that he had almost lost himself to, and rather ironically, it was those who control violence that saved him. The walls of an MMA gym gave Strickland a safe outlet to expend all that pent-up aggression and trauma. He fell in love with the fight game, the unrestrained, brutal warfare that elicits visceral feelings of elation. Two men or women waging war to determine who is the most skilled, who has the most heart, and who wants it more. Nothing exists, just the moment. Within 9 fights, Sean had strapped gold around his waist, laying claim to the middleweight KOTC championship, a belt that he would go on to defend 4 times. His impressive performances earned him a spot in the UFC, making his welterweight debut at UFC 171. His career would meet some setbacks, but in 2020, returning from injury, Sean would move up to a weight class and start an undefeated middleweight streak for the next couple years. He would unfortunately stumble for the first time at middleweight against Alex Pereira, who was on a crash course toward the undefeated middleweight champion Israel Adesanya. Sean infamously would state that he could stand and bang with the best strikers in the world, but I think he meant stand and get banged because he was knocked out in the first round with a devastating left hook courtesy of a man they call Hands of Stone. What he lacked in the performance was certainly made up for by the hype he generated in the press conference.
When we fight, I knock you out, I'm gonna do a TikTok dance over your grave.
Oh, look at this grown-ass man on TikTok. Maybe that's the problem, bro.
And
you don't want this guy's a champion.
This loss would be compounded by a controversial split decision to Jared Cannonier at the end of the year. After making a quick turnaround a month later to beat Nassourdine Imavov on short notice, a video would drop that would signal the new era for Sean Strickland.
We out here, me and my Chris Curtis as well. What's up, man?
Sean Strickland was born, a man who had once rejected a certain culture, now fully embraced it. It flowed through his very veins. His next performance would be one of a lifetime, putting on display in full the true might of Deshawn. Then, history was about to change forever. After Izzy froze Poatan like Elsa, finally dispatching the opponent that had destroyed him 3 times, he felt that he had settled the score and laughed last. A rematch with the emphatic Brazilian was off of the cards, and so Izzy awaited for his next opponent to rise to the top at middleweight. A matchup between gatekeeper Robert Whittaker and surging finisher Atheist Du Plessis was announced, and the winner of this bout was to be the next contender for the middleweight title. In an upset that no one saw coming, Atheist would stun audience by knocking out Robert in the second round. Unfortunately, Atheist picked up an injury in this bout and would be unable to make the quick 6-week turnaround for the pay-per-view coming up in Sydney, Australia, a card to be built around Israel Adesanya. On August 9th, Sean Strickland was announced to step in the ring against Stylebender. He would open as a massive 7-1 underdog. As far as the audience was concerned, Strickland didn't stand a chance. The comment sections and tweets were laden with the sentiment that the press conference was the only thing to look forward to, as the fight was over before it had even begun. Well, they were right about one thing. Sean walked away from the press conference with more fans and hype than I have seen generated for a fighter in eons. Israel almost silenced by the relentless nature of Sean's words. But in a turn of events that no one saw coming, Sean Strickland beat the dog out of the last dog bender.
Shout out to the puppy.
Deshawn proved that despite all the cards stacked against him, he could rise to the challenge. It was one of the most inspiring and beautiful moments this sport has ever been graced with. There is no feeling more elating than that when a massive underdog pulls off an unbelievable upset, and it's fair to say that this fight was one of the biggest of all time. Adesanya went from taunting 12-year-olds to begging Sean not to bring his family into the post-fight press conference. The fight broke the internet for a few days, even a few weeks, and now the world lives in a timeline where Deshawn Strickland is the middleweight champion of the world, and I think that we are all here for the ride. Africa has produced many great athletes and champions, from world caliber sharpshooters to MMA legends themselves. Among them is a rising mixed martial arts talent hailing from South Africa, an intimidating man with explosive power. Dricus Du Plessis would spend the first 4 years of his fighting career with EFC, where he would go 11-1, all victories coming by way of stoppage, 9 of which were submissions. Du Plessis was brutal inside of the cage, and his bloody warfare saw him become the EFC welterweight and middleweight champion simultaneously, and to top it off, the KSW middleweight champion as well. With a 100% finishing rate, Dricus would be invited to the UFC in 2020. His arrival was announced with the devastation that had preceded him, garnering himself a 5-fight winning streak, destroying top opponents such as Darren Till and Derek Brunson, going to decision only once against the durable Brad Tavares. On the 22nd of April 2023, Dana White would announce that Dricus's impressive win streak had earned him a fight against notorious gatekeeper Robert Whittaker in a middleweight title eliminator at UFC 290. Dricus, as you would imagine, opened up as a plus 300 underdog. Although the South African was unbeaten in his UFC tenure, many felt that he was untested, whereas Whittaker, on the other hand, had only ever lost to Izzy at middleweight. Many people, unsurprisingly, counted Dricus out, but he was holding a secret close to his chest, or his face you might say. A lot of critics of Du Plessis' fights would point towards his lack of stamina and conditioning inside of the cage. By the end of the first round, he would be breathing heavily through his mouth and look extremely tired. The thing is, he wasn't really tired. It was just one of his nasal passages was completely blocked and the other was damaged. He had no choice but to breathe through his mouth. According to him, he was only getting around 8% oxygen through his nose. And so during fight week of his Robert Whittaker matchup, he would discuss his most recent super soldier experiment: nasal surgery.
Last we made this procedure you had, this nasal procedure, I guess, can you talk to us about, can you quantify how much different you are in training so far, or is that only going to be revealed in the fight? Like, how much of a difference is this making?
And there's definitely a difference, but how big of a difference? You know, am I going to get tired? Most certainly, because if you look at the output that I put, anybody in the world will get tired from that. But maybe I look a little bit better doing it.
On July 8th, 2023, during the Year of the Underdog, a new mythical fighter graced the canvas. 2 Nostrils Du Plessis, the terrifying finisher that had risen to the top of the pile at middleweight, was simply the calm before the storm. In a breathtaking turn of events, the seemingly unconquerable Whittaker was taken out in the second round by a stiff jab and a flurry of punches. According to Israel Adesanya, he had manifested this, but the only manifestation is the will of the MMA gods. They blessed the world with their mysticism, and now we are honoured to give 2 Nostril Du Plessis his rightful place on this list.
I would just like to introduce the first of 3 guest spots on this video. My good friend Napoleon Blown Apart will be doing the next segment, and then later on in the video Lionel will do a segment, and then later on after that Troy Robert will be doing a segment. I'm truly blessed to have these content creators coming on and giving a guest appearance, so thanks very much to them, and be sure to check them out. Their channels are linked in the description below. So without further ado, let's give it up for Napoleon.
Rory MacDonald was a man possessed with the kind of hollow-eyed gaze normally seen on a 2nd century marble bust, and commonly referred to as resting maniac face. It was a gaze that either said, "I was dropped on my head as a child," or "I'm about to drop you on your head." Rory had a violent streak wider than a 747's landing strip, which he claimed was born of unresolved childhood trauma. But unfortunately for Rory, Tumblr and Midwest emo weren't a thing in those days, so despite all his rage, Rory's only outlet was simulating murder in a cage. Originally known as the Canadian Psycho due to his Pat Bateman-like stare, MacDonald eventually changed his moniker to the Red King for 2 reasons. Firstly, because Rory is the anglicised version of the Irish name Rory, whose literal translation is Red King, and secondly, because it sounds impossibly badass when paired with his chosen profession of beating men into a living death for cash. Rory would see himself garner an impressive record of 18-3 before being offered a title fight against the reigning welterweight champion Robbie Lawler. This was the 2nd time they had fought each other, and Lawler MacDonald too would go down in history as the most egregious display of blood flow outside of an Overlook hotel elevator. This was the kind of fight that either cements your love of MMA for all time, or convinces you that this shit needs to be banned immediately. Lawler McDonald too was the apex of Rory's career. Despite losing the fight, McDonald fought through a literal mask of blood, and to quote my lady love Valentina, his nose was rose. All of this earned him a reputation as one of the most violentest men on earth. Rory had entertained Christianity in his early years, and despite our Lord and Saviour's own MMA prowess, as we all know, Jesus didn't tap, a Christian lifestyle didn't really jive with Rory's chosen profession of offering skulls for the skull throne. Every step he took further and further from God's light was a step closer to the just bleed gods. This distancing from the Almighty's golden light had given Rory free rein to employ his murderous art form, despite the nagging seed of religion that was germinating in the deep recesses of his mind. But little did we know, the final skull Rory would offer for the skull throne would be his own. It's hard not to assume that the Lawler fight changed Rory. That fight took years off both men's careers, and it was Rory who seemed to be on the receiving end of the majority of the punishment. Even his coach admitted that the fight was a crossroads in his career. The fork in the road led to a chance meeting with his future wife, Olivia, a woman who unfortunately for just bleed enthusiasts everywhere would replace Rory's bloodlust with rich Franklin-esque Bible lust, all of which led to a shift in the mindset of the Red King. His friendship with the blood god Khorne was ended. Now Jesus was his best friend. Once religion became more prominent in his life, Rory discovered that the 11th commandment is "Thou shalt not send motherfuckers to the Shadow Realm," and his entire outlook on fighting changed. Whilst he didn't step away from the fight game entirely, his performances after finding Jesus underneath the Octagon had lost their previous brutality. Rory seemed different somehow, less engaged, less vicious, less sanguine. After a majority draw against John Fitch in Bellator, he himself would admit that he had simply lost his edge, and so it was that the legend of Atheist Rory, the man who would crush the spirits of welterweights like skulls underneath a tank tread, was ended, and in its place we had Baptized Rory, a man whose career never saw another KO or TKO victory, and who traded wins and losses back and forth until his eventual retirement in 2022.
I landed some good stuff in there, but I don't know, something is just, it's hard to sometimes pull the trigger now, I guess. I don't have that killer inside. I don't know, it's really hard to explain, but I hesitate a little bit now. I don't know what to say. It wasn't my best performance.
Are you feeling that as you get older and you have more things happening in your life, that you're changing as a fighter?
Yeah, as a man, I feel like God has really called me the last little while, and I don't know, he's changed my spirit, changed my heart, and it takes a certain spirit to come in here and put a man through pain and stuff, and I don't know if I have that same drive to hurt people anymore. I don't know what it is, but it's confusing, but I know the Lord has something in store for me, but he was speaking to me in here tonight, and I don't know, it's a different feeling.
Chuck Liddell was the epitome of early 2000s brutality. What with his short mohawk, ice-frozen blue shorts, head tattoos, and a face that says, "I beat my wife," Liddell was a pioneer of the sport and had a look to match. His performances in the cage were barbaric and wicked, whether it was head kicks in the UFC or a flurry of destructive looping punches against the ropes in Pride. Chuck Liddell made you want to tune in and watch concentrated violence unfold on live TV. The sprawl and brawl Californian had an appetite for KOs, and what made this all the more intimidating was the vacant stare he gazed through his opponents with before more than likely delivering them first class to the Shadow Realm. As it were, it was a look in his eyes, a calm before a devastating storm that Chuck began to be known for. His performances would see him claim the light heavyweight throne at UFC 52 against Randy Couture, a lofty royal seat he would sit upon for many years and multiple defenses. That look, always in his eyes, always hungry for one more vicious knockout. But as with all things, they wax and wane. Just as the rising and the fall of the moon, Chuck Liddell entered the twilight of his career a luminary, his winning streak legendary, and still with a light heavyweight championship in tow. But one bitter night, he would awaken a different man, and on the horizon was a career fall-off for the ages. After beating Tito Ortiz for the second time, Chuck would go on to lose 6 of his last 7 fights. In the early stages of this fall-off, the commentary team and the audience audience would notice that Chuck had perhaps lost that look in his eyes, faded and glazed over from decades of violent combat. Those years etched into his retina left him looking like he didn't quite want to be there, a disinterested shell of a man. To make matters worse, the commentary team would curse the former champion by stating during his final few walkouts that Chuck did have that look back in his eyes, but the look, whether it was forced or otherwise, was useless. His chin was aged and weathered. His career was over. The ending chapter characterized by brutal knockout after brutal knockout, from an icon of the sport, a household name, to a carcass on the canvas. Chuck will always be remembered for the mohawk stripe down his head and carrying the UFC on his back in the early stages. Bad career ending or not, he will always be legendary. There are very few fighters who climb dominantly into the title picture. The UFC is a tough and bitter road to trudge, each step perilous and deadly. Those who manage to clutch the belt are often battle-scarred and weary. Peter Yan, following in the footsteps of the few, had barely taken any damage in his extensive career, a singular questionable split decision loss that he would ultimately get revenge on. Yan was elusive. His opponents would swing on a phantom that was no longer there. Their lust to draw the blood of the Russian would leave them overextended, playing right into Yan's game plan. He would meet them with impressive counters and then angle off, never to be touched. This style was not only flashy, but incredibly frustrating for all those who stepped into the cage against him. This trademark style would see him not only become the UFC bantamweight champion, but also a 15-1 record. There was one man who felt that he had the answer to Peter's vexing style, and that was the cringy backpack himself, Aljamain Sterling.
You better win your fight, because I'm coming on your ass. What the fuck?
In their matchup, Yan would prove to nullify Sterling's wrestling, what many thought to be the deciding factor. As the rounds wore on, it was obvious that Yan was pulling ahead, but then tragedy struck. In some confusion between Yan's corner and himself, he threw a knee into the cranium of Sterling, temporarily turning him into a method actor. His role of choice? Michael B. Jordan from Creed. The controversial fight would declare Sterling the winner, casting the bantamweight division into 2 years of mourning, until he was eventually knocked out by O'Malley, signaling a new era for the 135-pounders, the Sugar era. The thing is, if this fight took place under the rule set of one championship, Sterling would have found himself waltzing back to the B-leagues fighting tomato cans, because kneeing, as his good friend Demetrius Johnson knows, is perfectly legal at any point during a bout. Thus, the legend goes that in some alternative reality, the mythical fighter known as One Championship Rules Yan still reigns over the bantamweights.
After being dropped off to the Shadow Realm without his luggage, courtesy of Walker Airlines at Fight Night Magny vs Ponzinibbio, Khalil Rountree had a lot to reflect on. His fighting style was fun to watch, but he could never quite piece together a meaningful win streak. Falling short in the Ultimate Fighter finale and getting submitted by Tyson Pedro in his UFC debut were hard pills to swallow. The icing on the metaphorical cake was getting elbowed in the face and put unconscious by Johnny Walker, who was still in his "I'm gonna spam controller combinations until you die" phase. Rountree decided that a training camp spent with Tiger Muay Thai would be the revolution he needed in his fighting arsenal to get back to his winning ways. A grueling camp in the humid jungle of Thailand took place over the course of 5 exhausting months. Rountree would put his newfound skill set to the test at UFC 236 against Eric Anders. And immediately as the bell rang out amidst the stadium, Rountree hunted down Anders with a consummate Thai stance. There was no question that this was a new and improved Khalil, unironically manufactured in Thailand like all American shit. What took place over the next 15 minutes can only be described as a Muay Thai clinic. Rountree, embracing his inner raw tang, dismantled Anders' legs in the most vicious and disgusting way. The sound of the leg kicks alone were enough to break the femurs off cross-country runners. That day, the legend of Bangkok ready Rountree Jr. was born. A man who with just one training camp was seemingly good enough to win any Muay Thai world title. Rountree has since gone on to prove his worth, earning several Performance of the Night bonuses. But even with an active 4-fight win streak under his belt, it's not enough to deter the UFC from feeding him to an undefeated Azamat Murzakanov this December.
On January 14, 2018, Kamaru Usman would face down Emil Meek in a welterweight scrap, a pivotal fight for Usman, who was edging dangerously close to a championship opportunity. In the fight, Usman would fully commit to crotch sniffing in a dominant yet lackluster performance. In the 15-minute decision victory, Usman had a staggering 13 minutes of control time on the ground, courtesy of 8 separate takedowns. Whilst the Just Bleed gods would demand more bloodshed, the fact was this performance was absolutely one-sided and authoritative. narrative, but audiences around the world would be blindsided by what Usman had to say in the post-fight interview.
Everybody knows what I'm capable of. That was 30% right there, and I still dominated a tough so-called Viking. Dominated him, and that was at 30%.
Whilst commentators and head honchos alike would be annoyed by the fact that Usman had only provided a 30% effort, the real question quickly became, if this was only 30% of what Usman had to offer, then what on earth was 100% of Usman's fighting ability? Emil Meek seemingly spared by an injured Usman holding back, and now fight fans across the world would have to sit back, attempting to conceptualize an Usman unchained, an Usman with the pedal to the metal. The thought of this fighter puts fear into most who would even for 1 second consider it. It is also said that Usman's family are notorious for only giving 30% of their ability, what with his brother consuming only 30% of steroids on planet Earth, and their father only doing 30% of his accounting. In an unprecedented turn of events, at the height of public discourse during President Trump's administration, Kanye West would attempt to unite a fractured nation by meeting with the man himself inside of the White House. After their meeting, Kanye would comment on what they shared in common, saying that they both had dragon energy, a concept not easily understood by the masses, but 100% digestible by those who had spent their childhood in the boots of the Dovahkiin. I knew what dragon energy was, and I knew that Trump had it flowing through his veins. What I wasn't quite aware of was the fact that in his presence, some of its properties could be passed on, transmitted via mythical osmosis. Unfortunately for the welterweight division and Democrats alike, Donald Trump's favourite fighter is Colby Chaos Covington, the man of twisted sex appeal and raw American steel, bashing nerds circa 2016 and getting his relentless cardio from nighttime activities, probably with half of Miami's paid-for females. After attending a rally and shaking the president's hand, Chaos Covington would be infected with dragon energy.
You know, I feel like I got some dragon energy from him, and it doesn't matter if they put Hulk in the cage or Superman this weekend, no one's gonna beat me.
Something he would use to shatter Tyron Woodley, the Frozen One's ribs, in a one-sided dominant performance soon after. In the post-fight interview, Colby would famously receive a call from the Dragon Energy Overlord himself.
Oh, the POTUS is calling me. Mr. President, I got the President of the United States. Dragon energy. When I see you. When I see you.
Where he would state that even if it was King Kong in front of him, he would have destroyed him, leaving 2 canonical ways to kill the 8th wonder of the world: beauty and dragon energy. In a rare bout of 2 mythical fighters colliding, Dragon Energy Covington would be bested by 30% Usman, but Dragon Energy would prove to be enough to baptize Masvidal in his last outing. Let's see if this mythical fighter will eventually become undisputed champ later this year. Eternally pulling himself up by the bootstraps, Michael Chandler has proven that if you can't make bank through sheer talent, you might as well do the MMA equivalent of kamikaze and become the embodiment of entertainment inside the octagon by putting CTE well before a win. Chandler burst into the UFC by destroying Dan Hooker and going on to almost become the lightweight champion of the world in a back and forth barn burner with Charles Oliveira. Chandler has since been hit or miss in his career, but remained in the top echelon of the division. Most recently, his entertaining style has well and truly earned him a red panty night with none other than Mystic Mac himself, and rightfully so. Whilst his losses have always meant that the fans won by watching Chandler go out on his shield in beautiful bloody warfare, Chandler would famously bring the media desk to tears in a Shakespearean breakdown of his performance post-title fight defeat.
I really feel like I'm living a dream. Win, lose, or draw. You know, here we are. Got a busted up eye and another loss on my record, but hey, I've come back from worse. Felt like everything was clicking in there. Just got caught, zigged when I should have zagged, and here we are talking to you without the belt on this table, but we're gonna keep moving forward as stuff moves fast.
He would utter into existence the distinct possibility of another, rare and mythical fighter, Zagged instead of Zigged Chandler, a man who, if he had taken the left road instead of the right, would be the UFC lightweight world champion. There are multiple points throughout the Oliveira fight where we can quite clearly see Chandler zigging instead of zagging, and whilst it may not be obvious to casuals, hardcore fans can certainly see the distinction. It's strange to think that multiple losses would be Thanos snapped out of existence with a simple zag, and thus the mythical fighter remains untapped, but ready to be deployed. Once lacerated and with crimson spewing forth from the slashes on his face, Nathaniel Diaz becomes the embodiment of any song off of Deftones' sophomore album, Around the Fur. Those who were unfortunate enough to leave a gash upon the brow of Stockton's finest would be treated to the overwhelming pitter-patter of constant 1-2s infused with scarlet. See, Diaz doesn't really turn it on until he gets hurt. The potential within him somewhat held back until he is made to bleed. Years of street fights and brawls in the UFC have left him and his brother with a face full of scar tissue that easily tears. But this mythical fighter is waiting for this very moment. Ask McGregor, who in their first fight was piecing him up for the entirety of the first round, right up until the splits began to leak warm vermilion onto the canvas. McGregor would become McTapper, and the legend of Bleeding Nate Diaz would intensify. But getting Diaz to bleed is but the first stage to this terrifying mythical fighter. With crimson dripping to the canvas and his health bar dropping to 0, you think you have him beat. Then, a new song begins to stir. Diaz enters his second phase. Unlike John Morgan,
You said you had one lung yesterday. It's not my fault you ate your other lung.
Diaz was blessed with the finest pair of lungs known to man, and as if Miyazaki himself had created Nathan Diaz, 6th round Diaz precedes the mythical fighter that came before, the cardio machine himself, an unrelenting tide of pressure in the waning minutes of 5-round spectacles. The sport of MMA is brutally tiresome work, but Diaz, with a set of lungs conditioned over countless triathlons, always turns up an extra gear. His opponents, often unable to match that impressive conditioning, leave it to Stockton's own to have multiple myths around him. The featherweight division has spewed out more legends, icons, and GOATs than most divisions, and it goes without saying, we are living in an era where quite possibly one of the greatest mixed martial artists to ever live sits upon the throne of the 145-pounders. His ascension to snatch the crown for a long time went unrecognised, despite his talent, violence, and impressive performances. For whatever reason, people were unamused by the Australian's win streak, but no one could deny Alexander the Great after dispatching Chad Mendes at UFC 232. Volk, undefeated, and now in the top 3 of the featherweights, it was apparent that he had stamped his ticket to title contention, and awaiting him in the matchup was a man many considered to be one of the greatest featherweights of all time, Max Holloway. Blessed would prove to be a stepping stone for Alexander's own greatness, however, a crucible that Alexander would conquer twice, yet people would still deny the eminence that quite clearly emanated from this newly crowned mixed martial artist. It wasn't until Volkanovski embraced his inner Krillin in all his leukemia-ridden form did Alexander unmask the true majesty that lay beneath. Seeing bold Volk was something mere mortals couldn't comprehend on first sight. It wasn't until reintroducing Brian Ortega to CTE, a friend that he hadn't seen since Max Holloway had acquainted them 2 years previous, did fans understand that bold Volk was an unmovable object. If that performance wasn't enough, he would mangle the Korean zombie in a one-sided beatdown, outwork Max a third time, and then move up to lightweight and have an incredibly close fight with Wish.com Khabib. These performances cemented Alex's pound-for-pound worthy status. Fans have since come around to him, and when a Volk fight is on, we know that we are going to get a thrilling, masterful performance inside of the cage. Yair Rodriguez was the most recent carcass to be dangled in front of a bloodthirsty audience, and we can only assume more victories are on the way. Bold Volk, truly one of the most terrifying mythical creatures to exist.
Bold Volk's coming for everyone!
Ronda Rousey was one of the biggest stars in the sport during her heyday, and without a doubt put women's MMA on the map. Without her, there would be no Rose Namajunas, Amanda Nunes, or Valentina Shevchenko. She had pretty much driven Dana's decision to allow women into the UFC. She was dominant, ending up in movies, on front covers, and in the WWE. She also had the ability to back up the claim that she was the greatest female fighter on earth, going undefeated for the majority of her career, utilizing her gold medal Olympic judo background to great efficiency by snatching the arm off of her opponents in multiple bouts. While she would ultimately get exposed for poor striking, it was rather interesting to see the hype train that had been built around her, Joe famously stating that she could stand and bang with the likes of Floyd Mayweather. In retrospect, it's kind of embarrassing, but also eye-opening as to what getting caught up in the frenzy of hype can do to even the best of the sport's experts. But that's not why Ronda is on this list. During the height of her career, she would sit down in an interview and claim the following: "In any given moment, under the right circumstances, I think it is possible impossible, Rousey said of beating Velasquez when asked if she thought she could. You cannot tell me that it is physically impossible. It is possible that in any given moment I could beat him. I simply believe in my possibilities. Whilst we certainly will never know what these right circumstances are, what this given moment would look like, what we can rightly do is be awe-stricken by the very notion that there is genuinely and factually from the horse's mouth a way for this bantamweight female to destroy the mythical fighter himself, sea-level Cain Velasquez, and that is truly a terrifying thought. There is a reason that Robbie is a fan favourite, and it's not just because he is touched by the grace of mysticism. Robbie has traversed all eras of the sport, from its grim beginnings to its cleansed and sponsored glittering 4K present. With multiple stints in the UFC to wars inside the Strikeforce cage, Lawler has been dishing out performance of the night, month and year throughout his long and savage career. But his career will forever be cemented in history for his electrifying and slugfest-infused title run. It was here at the pinnacle of the sport that the mythical fighter known as Fifth Round Robbie Lawler would be born. Let me take you back to July 11th, 2015. A spray of crimson spews from the mouth of Robbie Lawler, the reigning, defending UFC welterweight title holder. Robbie stares down a beaten and bloody Rory McDonald. Rory is swaying. His arms are loose and limp down by his side, and whilst his body language is that of a man who is on the verge of collapse, his mentality is unbroken. He glares back with vehement determinism at his foe. They both should be slumped over on their stools, taking in the final advice from their coaches as the fifth round looms, but instead they are locked eyes in the centre of the cage, both men drenched in scarlet that is infused with sweat. 4 rounds of relentless non-stop action has just ensued. This is surely one of the most iconic moments to ever take place in MMA. The crowd's screams would suggest yes. It was here that we were witnessing the second appearance of fifth round Robbie Lawler, the mythical fighter that rarely rears its bloodthirsty head. He knew as he stared down his wilting foe that the bell would not only usher in the fifth round, but also herald the coming of the celestial beast of a fighter, the fearsome and ruthless evolution of Lawler. The final round would end just 1 minute later, with fifth round Lawler breaking the Red King. We had seen this man once before, after terrorizing the diminishing gas tank of Johnny Hendricks, going on to win the rematch and ultimately the welterweight strap. And the final rare glimpse we saw was his second title defense against Carlos Condit, in which both would swing wildly until the final buzzer. Robbie has since retired, and with it, this mythical fighter has laid to rest. Georges St. Pierre at the height of his reign would fall out of the limelight due to injury, laying waste to a much anticipated matchup against Nick Diaz, a man who had successfully moved back into the UFC from Strikeforce, dispatching BJ Penn in his return. GSP and Diaz were expected to square off at UFC 143, but ultimately George would withdraw due to an ACL injury, leaving the ever-violent and maniacal Carlos Condit to step in and face down the Stockton native for the interim welterweight title. Then, in an unprecedented turn of events, the usually polite, reserved, typical mild-mannered Canadian, GSP would drop a segment on primetime TV to hype up the surrogate title matchup in his absence. Diaz had rubbed the welterweight champ the wrong way, and with it, the world was about to be introduced to a new mythical fighter, Dark Places GSP.
He act crazy, but he's not crazy. It's fake. It's a fake crazy, and I'm not afraid of him. He doesn't know where I come from. He doesn't know what I've been through to my life. I probably had more street fight than he ever had in his life. Believe me, I have my own demon in my head. People has no idea how dark I am in my head sometimes.
The revelation that a dark chasm had always been gaping below the surface of the seemingly well put together welterweight champion was enough to put shivers down the spine of most fans of this sport. Whilst Condit would ultimately win the interim title, George wasn't ready to drop the angst he had held towards Diaz. He didn't want to let go of the fact that he was indeed darker and more broken than Nick, and so despite riding a loss, Diaz was gifted the shot against GSP in what is widely considered the bleakest page in the history books of the UFC GOAT. GSP would switch up his usual persona and for whatever reason go to war with the Californian.
You think I'm afraid of you?
No, that's fine. Okay, no, I don't.
You think I'm afraid of you, man? Are you crazy in your head, man? I'm not scared of you. You'll see Saturday if I'm scared of you.
Alright.
GSP would ultimately show that there is a pit of despair deep in his heart, and whilst it's hard to imagine what that actually looks like and what had caused it, all we know is we have no idea how dark he is inside his head sometimes. After the UFC had invested almost every last penny into a world tour for the ages, promoting Aldo and McGregor, the last thing on their wish list was for Aldo to pull out of the fight due to injury. But alas, this is MMA, and the worst possible outcome is often the most likely. Just ask any person who had to watch Belal Muhammad wrestle fuck his way further and further away from a title shot for the last several years.
Belal Muhammad. He's ugly.
McGregor's pull-out game, on the other hand, was as strong as his own tibia, meaning that despite the removal of Aldo 2 weeks before their fight, his immediate reaction was to ask for another opponent. And so this is how we ended up with Chad Mendes, member of Team's Shortest Alpha Male, a squad of elite dwarfs that worked Monday to Friday on the set of Magic Mike and spent Saturday knocking out men the size of 5th graders. It goes without saying that Mendes taking the fight on such short notice was a big move for such a small person, taking on the surging mythical fighter that was karate stance McGregor, right in the midst of his near flawless ascension. That takes a ton of testosterone derived from elk meat, but Mendes felt that he had the answer for McGregor and was ready to show the world. In the fight, Mendes would have a back and forth first round, exchanging on the feet but coming up short to McGregor's elusive style. He would, however, begin to find success on the ground, elbowing and smashing McGregor. After the first round, Mendes looked exhausted. The fact that the man had taken the fight on such short notice was becoming apparent. He was breathing deep and not recovering well at all in the corner. In the second round, Mendes, despite his diminishing gas tank, would spike McGregor on his ass for essentially the entirety of the round, raining down elbows, and was quite clearly winning the round in dominant fashion. McGregor, in all his resilience, however, would leave it until the last 30 seconds to reverse the position and get to his feet. Anyone who was paying attention at this point knew that the fight was over. Mendes looked absolutely wasted, tired beyond belief, and now, a deer in the headlights of an Irish freight train, McGregor would viciously stab Mendes in the gut with a series of devastating kicks, spelling the beginning of the end. Mendes crumpled to the floor after a beautiful 1-2, and it was over. The question was, with Mendes putting on such a fantastic performance on 2 weeks' notice, what could he do with a full camp? Would we have seen a completely different story? Well, the myths say yes. The legends say that deep in the bowels of the Just Bleed God's sanctuary, there is a fighter so cardio efficient he would have beat the Lucky Charms right out of the Irish superstar, and his name is Full Camp Mendes. If he isn't shooting guns, riding horses, or nearly dying in cave diving expeditions, Donald Cerrone was probably head-kicking your favourite prospect into the dark recesses of the Shadow Realm. Now retired Hall of Famer, Cerrone was a beast during his career, going on lengthy win streaks and even challenging for the lightweight title. It goes without saying that Cowboy was a legend in the sport. Chances were highly likely that he was your wife's boyfriend's favourite fighter. After being bested by future welterweight champion Leon Edwards, Cerrone would have the privilege of becoming a father, but little did he know sowing his seed would mean that he would channel heaven-sent mythical Modelo energy, brewed for those with a fighting spirit. In his first outing as a father, he would rip the arm off of everyone's favourite 2% African Florida man, Mike Perry.
And I was 2% African, so I am legally allowed to say the word.
A performance of the night worthy bout. Following that, Cerrone would go back down to lightweight and face off against surging newcomer Alexander Hernandez, who would famously bash Cerrone in the pre-fight press conference, and also quite famously would eat humble pie in the form of a dynamic tibia to the cranium, followed by a flurry of punches sending the rambunctious contender straight back to the early prelims. A few months later, Cerrone would headline an event against a real estate agent who just so happened to be a ranked lightweight contender. Ally Aquinta would be smashed about the Octagon in a dominant fight of the night, as Dad Cerrone, the fighter in all his mythical form, showed the true might of what it means to be on this very list. He would lift his son above his head, showing to the world that Dad Cerrone was indeed a fighter to be marvelled at. Unfortunately, Tony Ferguson, rather ironically, would start the inevitable career decline as age and a legacy of violence had caught up with Cowboy. The awe-inspiring performance of the night-worthy streak that becoming a father had sent Cerrone on was matched by a tear-inducing plummet to retirement, a 7-fight no-win streak, 5 of which Cerrone would be either knocked out or choked out. It's the expected, well-worn road that legends of this sport trudge down to end their career, and perhaps we've become callous to the cyclical nature of this tale. Cerrone brushed hands with mysticism for a brief while, and it was spectacular to bear witness.
A motivated BJ is something that most mortal men will never see from their wives. But we MMA fans witnessed a motivated BJ like nothing the world has ever seen. A motivated BJ Penn, that is. BJ Penn was truly the Jekyll and Hyde of MMA. Two manifestations of the same Hawaiian spirit. There's the BJ that consumes the blood of his opponents, dominates them, and twists them up on the ground, violently crushing their skulls with Pacific Island rage. However, the other side was very different. That side included a lackluster and unimpressive fighter who seemed to show up simply for the paycheck. But this list isn't about shortcomings or failure. It's about the myths and the legends of the sport. Motivated BJ Penn was an assassin, a pocket-sized powerhouse who constantly was underestimated. A brilliant philosopher named Israel Adesanya once said, "It's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog.
Shout out to the puppy.
BJ, despite every single factor being stacked against him, would destroy Matt Hughes in a massive upset. To stick with the dog theme, it was like witnessing a Chihuahua take down a pit bull that was juiced to the gills. In perhaps a more impressive move, he would go over to Japan to face some Gracie legends and Lyoto Machida, all in weight classes that he didn't belong. Despite that, moving down in weight, a motivated Penn would snatch the UFC lightweight crown, as well as defending it a singular time. There's a reason BJ is a legend, and it's because his fights were always exciting. He was vicious and he was deadly, but only when motivated to do so. BJ's record from a bird's eye view is less than spectacular. His career ended sitting at 16-14 with 2 draws, and his final years were spent on a 7-fight losing skid. Life inside the cage isn't an easy one, and BJ Penn, with the Hawaiian warrior blood coursing through his veins, was always biting off more than he could chew. The man was undersized in almost every single competition he partook. Pair that with the caliber of men that he was fighting, and his record doesn't seem so bad after all. Losing to GSP, Lyoto Machida, Frankie Edgar, Jens Pulver, Matt Hughes, and Rory McDonald is pretty inspiring when you consider that BJ was probably naturally a featherweight at best. And to think he claimed both the lightweight and the welterweight belt in a time where the sport was full of ruthless cutthroat killers is nothing short of unbelievable. To me, when I look at his career, I do away with those last 7 fights, putting it down simply to age and a sport that cinches its hooks into athletes who can't accept their time has come. Athletes with no one to tell them no. Athletes who are still clinging on to the adrenaline and the thrill of competition, the ecstasy of those lofty heights becoming an inescapable drug. I'll remember BJ as the most naturally gifted fighter that I've ever seen, but he's much more than that. He's also one of the greatest fighters to grace the UFC in the early years. A pioneer, motivated or not, he blazed the path for all those fighters to come. The image of him licking blood from his gloves will always be burned into my retina. Motivated BJ Penn is truly one of the most mythical fighters that the sport will ever know.
Heroes rise and fall, but myths are eternal. We are grateful each and every day to be inspired by these legends who have transcended their mortal shells. And now we look upwards, waiting for one more to descend and grace us with their presence. Until next time.